Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach, for this talk from our Apology Accepted series on the moral argument and the resurgence of moral apologetics. Now, I've been very excited to start this series. Hopefully, we won't have any technical difficulties. I filmed a little bit earlier today, and it seems as though things are working again. So we'll see. Please do tell me, though, in the stream chat if there's any issues, so that way maybe I'll see it and then I'll be able to respond and fix it in case it does happen. Now, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, this is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be a little bit different in terms of what we're going to do with this type of a talk. So, again, this talk is based off of a book, The Morals of a Story by the Baggetts. And Dr. Baggett was one of my PhD professors. Loved him. He was great. I took the class Moral Apologetics with him. It was a phenomenal time. I think he's at Houston Baptist now. I think he's at a different university now, but had a phenomenal time with that. And I purchased his book, one of his books. He has a couple of books, and read it and loved it. And I said, this is a perfect book to kind of go through and work through and discuss and talk through in one of our live stream sessions. And so we're going to be doing that. But this is going to be a little bit more conversational, possibly. I'm going to do my best to have the live stream chat open, and I will be I might be asking questions, depending if there's people there or not, asking questions, taking questions, making comments, again, based on if there's people present. And so feel free and respond in the moment, because I will be kind of taking those questions as they come, as opposed to all at the end like I normally do. And that's because if there are opportunities for conversation, I want to make sure that we take those opportunities. So the book, it starts out, and he kind of talks a little bit about his intended audience. And he says, well, God is going to refer to the Trinitarian God of the Bible, and that this argument from moral apologetics, which we'll get into in a moment what that is we're going to work from natural theology and general revelation. So there's the belief that there are two forms of revelation, general and special. General revelation is the things that we can know about God simply from creation. All creation displays His glory. Clearly, there are some things we can probably find out about Him through creation. And the argument is morality, its existence, is actually one of those things, and that morality actually does point to the triune God, in fact, which is fascinating. So that'd be an argument from natural theology or general revelation. Natural theology, again, just being the theology you can gain from creation. Special revelation is where we get our specific doctrine of God and things of that nature. It's the Bible, essentially. Although Jesus himself, while he's here on earth, would also be special revelation, and so would any divine revelation through the prophets, things like that. So we've got those things to start out. We're talking about moral apologetics. We're talking about an argument from morality to demonstrate God's existence, or at least say that Christian theistic view, Trinitarian theistic view, is the best explanation for the morality that we observe and for the moral characteristics that we observe. So then he jumps into the shape and sequence of the argument. He says, okay, this is a cumulative argument. So what we're going to do with the moral argument is we're essentially going to say there are a number of, and specifically four traits or characteristics, observations, if you will, about the world, specifically about morality and human beings. And these four things can only really best be explained by a Christian theistic worldview, that all the other worldviews fail to do justice to these four things to the level that Christianity does. And so by essentially making the case of these four things, it makes the case for the Christian worldview and God. Now, he starts out by mentioning one of the oldest issues or questions posed against gods or God. And it was, again, the Euthyphro Dilemma. And the Euthyphro Dilemma states this: is something moral because God wills it, or does God will something because it's moral? Now, that's actually not the true Euthyphro Dilemma. The true Euthyphro Dilemma goes a little bit like this: is something moral because the gods, plural, will it, or do the gods will something because it's moral? Now, here's why it's a dilemma. Because if the gods will it, and that makes it moral, then it seems arbitrary or capricious. In other words, the gods are flawed, the gods have all these problems, they could change their mind even. So it kind of just destabilizes morality. Or does God will something that's moral? Well, then that assumes that there's something moral outside of God. In other words, there's something that superintends upon God himself. So that's why they call it a dilemma, or the Euthyphro Dilemma. Now, we're going to attack that and break that down later. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Why is something moral? Is it because God wills it, or is it because it is moral? What do we use as our foundation of morality? Where do we seat it? Okay, that's sort of the big question. What is morality, right? And he goes through a number of different historical examples of the moral argument, which we won't cover right now. So he's then going to go on to just kind of give an overview of the rest of his book, and then jumps to spotlighting Socrates and Paul in Athens. So I think Bagot rightly affirms there are some serious similarities between Socrates and Paul. First, we have to understand when Paul is summoned before the Areopagus at Mars Hill, his big apologetics-ish sermon, right? We got to understand what's actually going on there. So here's the issue. If someone is going to introduce a new god to be revered and worshipped, they have to appear before essentially the council at Areopagus and present their case for the gods. Okay? They've got to do this. So that's why Paul's summoned, to present a case. So it's fascinating. It's almost like the apologist's dream, right? You literally get summoned to say, why should we worship your God? And then you get to present an apologetic argument. I mean, how cool is that? But that's literally what's going on here. And the Athenians actually think that Paul is introducing two gods. They think that he's introducing Jesus as one god, and then the anastasis, or resurrection, as a goddess. So it's kind of a weird thing that they're dealing with anyway. They think it's like two gods. So what is the protocol of this meeting at the Areopagus? So first they want a definition. Who are these new gods? What are they the gods of? Explain your gods. Okay, teach us what's the deal with your gods. Then they ask, well, why do they deserve a place among the gods recognized in Athens? So why should we ascend them? Because remember, this is money. There's a lot of stuff involved with a god being a god of a city, okay, or even one among the pantheon. That's substantial, okay? And third, anyone who wants to accuse or say you're wrong can also be present. So essentially, you've got all three of these things going on in Paul's little mini apologetic sermon. Okay. Now, as far as Socrates is concerned, he's going to argue that the evidence for the gods is lacking. Okay, that's what he's going to say. Essentially, when Socrates goes and has these conversations, he's going to say, look, the evidence for the gods are lacking. They're fickle, feeble. There's no good evidence for these things. Yet all the while, he talks about being driven by the divine, or some force higher than him, or some being higher than himself. So it's kind of fascinating. People often wonder, well, does he believe in God? What does he really think? Well, he believes in divinity of some kind. He didn't believe in the gods as stated in the pantheon. Okay, and again, what his divinity was, tough to tell. Reason. He might have called divinity reason, for example. But again, you got to tease it apart. Paul also believed that the evidence for the gods was lacking in terms of the pantheon. But he said this, and this is fascinating, that the evidence for the right theology, or the right God, is actually now available. So he actually would acknowledge that Socrates was right, that there's no evidence for the gods and we don't really have anything. But now we do. And his argument was going to be essentially the resurrection. And that's one of his main centerpieces, is the evidence for the resurrection. And so we're going to see this, Paul's evidence in Romans 2:14 through 16. So we'll go there first. Which says, so when the Gentiles who do not have the law instinctively do what the law demands, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their consciences confirm this. Their competing thoughts will either accuse or excuse them on the day when God judges what people have kept in secret, according to my gospel through Christ Jesus. In other words, morality's a major evidence. Okay? Another one is Acts 17:31. Because he had set a day when he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he had appointed. He has provided proof of this. Proof. To everyone by raising him from the dead. The resurrection. So Paul's really leaning on moral apologetics and the resurrection as two of his main arguments. So I find that interesting. I think that those two actually are some of the strongest arguments today for God's existence. Are simply those two. And so again, we can see some similarities between Socrates and Paul. Now, let's go ahead then and jump into the first chapter of the book. This is the chapter we're going to cover today. Again, these aren't going to be super long, but I hope to at least ponder. And again, I'm kind of keeping tabs here and seeing if there's any comments or questions or anything that pops up on the chat, because I would like to address those. So first he says, and this is very true, and I've read pretty much, actually I think I've read all of these guys that I'm about to list here. He says that the Apologetics has a long and rich history, and it really does, the moral apologetics specifically. You've got John Henry Newman, Clement Dorr, Henry Sedgwick, William Sorley, Hastings Rashdahl, A.E. Taylor, C.S. Lewis, Austin Farrer, H.P. Owen, and Clement Webb as just some of the people throughout history that have taken a real shot with the moral apologetics. And their works are fascinating. And again, like I said, I've read most of them. Actually, I think I've read all of them. And really, I mean, it's some very persuasive stuff. When you actually go and read these guys, it's very persuasive. And so there's been this comeback of moral apologetics, and I even saw this recently too. Over the last couple of years, people are now appealing to moral apologetics more and more. I think the reason is because as the Judeo-Christian worldview declines in America, and as people begin to reject biblical morality, their own worldview, the secular worldview, becomes more and more inconsistent to hold. You continually run into these problems where, for example, they're trying to and I remember watching one politician affirm children and then also affirm abortion on the same hand. And it's like, well, you're literally affirming, don't leave any child left behind, and yet you're talking about killing little children. So it starts to come apart at the seams. Again, you see this in the transgender and feminism movements right now. That transgenderism is affirming one thing, but then feminism is like, yeah, but this is kind of contrary to that. So what you see once you walk away from a Judeo-Christian worldview is these tensions start to develop, and these secular worldviews start to tear at each other and rip each other apart, essentially devour each other, because they're inconsistent and you can't hold these views simultaneously. They're contrary to each other, and you're starting to see this. So what are we seeing today? Well, today we're seeing a culture of offense. Okay. What we're seeing here is the moral high ground has shifted. Rather than loving your neighbor, the moral high ground is now, I'm going to be offended by something I disagree about. Okay? And that's the moral high ground. Oh, the person who takes a stand, who speaks against it, that's the moral high ground. Okay, that's very different than from before, where the moral high ground would essentially be to essentially treat others with respect no matter what their opinions are or beliefs are. Civil discourse is being vilified. There's no question. And I've seen people make this comment more and more. It's like some people try to say things like, oh, well, there's good people on both sides, or we need to at least listen to the other side. And then there's many people who say, no, we don't. The other side's the enemy. And that's what's more and more happening, is one side or the other on these various moral issues and other issues, it's becoming the enemy, to see them as the enemy. And that's how it's being promoted now. And so it's being harder and harder to actually have discussions about anything of real importance. If it's not important, you can talk all day about it. If it's entertainment, you can talk all day about it. But the second something becomes important, the second it's about politics or religion or beliefs or morality or anything that's important, no, you have to be silent. You have to keep that to yourself. And it's like, essentially, I want you to really think about this. Everybody's listening. I want you to think about this. What's happening is our culture is being essentially not only controlled, but it's being reduced to essentially a non-culture, to a culture of fluff, a culture of entertainment. The only things we're allowed to talk about are the things which have absolutely no bearing or importance, true importance. They're still fun to talk about at times, but I'm saying when you're not even allowed to talk about other things, well, it's a culture of control, it's a culture of conformity, it's a culture that's trying to destroy thinking and rational thought and logical thinking. That's where we're going. That's why it's so important to even talk about this stuff in public, because we're being told that everything of importance you can't talk about, and there's certain overlords who tell you what to think. And you deviate from that and you're done. We've got to fight back against this. So he also talks about moral ambivalence. So when the moral foundations erode, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be a way to compensate this. Okay? So I love how he talks about this. Humility, self-control, and temperance are gone. Okay? It's people are just straight up more arrogant, lack self-control, lack temperance. Those are gone. But there are, quote, sacred cows like race. It's like, okay, so what happens? Well, race gets blown out of proportion. It becomes the only thing we talk about. And then things like humility, self-control, temperance are just gone. Like, so it's essentially hyper-focusing on one thing and then blowing it so far out of proportion that it no longer resembles true morality or justice. And in fact, it actually, it comes at the expense of all those other things. Okay? And the problem is, our focus, and I like how he argues this, is on too little rather than on too much. And again, he makes this other comment, contemporary moral outrage is conspicuous and likely unprincipled. In other words, this is part of the problem. When you begin to look at the arguments people give for all of this stuff that they're angry about, all this things that they're unhappy about, and I've read some of the news recently, and some of their arguments in the news, it just shocks me. I'm like, either the people making the arguments are woefully uneducated, or they believe that the people reading the arguments are so woefully uneducated that they'll work. Either way, it's bad news. Because essentially what's happened is they're unprincipled. In other words, these moral arguments that the other sides are making, the secular side is making, don't actually hold water in any way, shape, or form. And again, here's an example of this. Okay, an example of this would be something like the abortion debate. The question that comes out is, and this really is the question the whole thing's founded on, is when is a human being a human being? Or what is the definition of a human being? So what does the pro-choice side say? Well, they make it about, it's the woman's body. Oh, okay, but that's, truth be told, yeah, there are things going on in the woman's body. We're not disarguing that. But the question that we have to address is there another human being's life at play? That's really the only question that matters. And yet that's the question that's constantly deviated from. Okay, that's the question that's constantly deviated from. And every attempt to restrict human life has been arbitrary. It's arbitrary. Oh, well, it's amount of intelligence, or it's whether they're conscious, or it's whether they can think, or whether they're viable, or whether whatever. It's like, yeah, but those don't define. See, the problem is this. If you're going to do that, and we're talking about this because it's moral apologetics here. If you're going to do that, you essentially have to say, are we holding to every adult having those things at all times, and that's the only thing humanity can be? This is essentially the problem. Why do we get to this place? Well, once you take the image of God away from mankind, in other words, you deny its existence, then you run into problems defining when human is human. That's essentially what happens. So you're going to see these things start to develop, and they've already have. And unfortunately, we've seen courts take over by brute power and authoritarianism, and that's seen as the only, quote, means of purification. And that's just simply not justice at all. And the other thing is what you're seeing is this, quote, injustice is people are using the language, quote, of righteousness. They're pitting good against evil. So the other thing I've seen a lot in the modern day politics and modern day kind of things, and again, we're just talking about morality in the country in general, is that the sides are, well, in certain situations, you're having some sides say the other side is evil. And in fact, I'll even say this, the way that Judeo-Christianity, conservative Judeo-Christianity is portrayed in this country at this point is as evil. Ignorant and evil. Those are the two main things. And I do mean evil. We're talking about people basically saying the church is now evil. That's the place we're going against. And that Christians are the enemy. And they have to be gotten rid of in one way or another. And people are trying to do a lot of different things to do that. So this is what we're facing right now. It is some heavy-duty stuff. Additionally, the larger outsized one aspect of morality typically becomes, the greater distortion it becomes. So again, the more it blows up, the greater and greater distortion that we'll have of it. And I would argue, and Baggett argues this as well, that morality does actually, and especially the moral argument and the pieces of it, really do explain the human condition, so why we are the way we are, and the meaning of life, if we understand it properly. And so, and I love how he kind of ends with this, he makes this kind of argument that the time is ripe for this stuff. We need arguments based on moral realism, that objective moral facts exist and that things are actually evil. Okay? Theistic ethics best explains this, and essentially naturalism and secular ethical theories try, and they do to some degree, but they don't actually do it as efficiently as Christianity. And so there are really three different prongs to any good moral argument. One, you have to defend moral realism, that there are objective moral facts and that evil is real. Two, you've got to defend theistic and Christian ethics. So in other words, why is the Christian ethic the right one? And that includes things like abortion, includes things like homosexuality and dealing with all that stuff. And then finally, you've got to critique secular ethical theories. And those are really the three prongs. And Plantinga, fascinatingly enough, he started when he was doing a lot of his work. He argued that rational belief in God doesn't need an argument. It's called Proper Basicality. A phenomenal book, by the way, which I'll just show you the cover of here. Give me 1 second, and I'll find it. I do have it here. Where is it? If I can't find it, then I'll just jump back. But I do know I have it somewhere here. Maybe I can't find it. Anywho, Warranted Christian Belief is the book. He's got a trilogy of books that are all really good. I highly recommend people read them. And then there's Bob Adams. Bob Adams got some quotes I'd like to read. So first one might find oneself, quote, utterly convinced that morality is objective, not dependent upon what human beings know or think, and that it cannot be explained in terms of any natural facts about human beings or other things. That it ultimately can't be explained in terms of physical, chemical, or biological facts. So, and then second, one may also be convinced that there could not be such an objective moral fact unless there were such a person as a God in one way or another legislates them. So two kind of truths emerge, right? Where do moral facts come from? They don't come from physics, biology, and chemistry. They just don't. Okay? They just don't. They don't come from logic and reason either. They don't. Logic and reason are a vehicle for verifying things. It doesn't generate truth. And the other thing is morality in general requires person-to-person contact. It requires someone saying something's wrong and something's right, and so, or legislating it. And so one thought is there's a God. Now, what's the issue? That we'll jump back here now to the issue of morality that we posed in the beginning, which was the Euthyphro Dilemma. So the problem is the Euthyphro Dilemma doesn't actually pose a problem for Christianity, and here's the reason why. Because the first prong of it, the second prong, we just simply deny that God says something because it is moral, and that's why he decrees it. We just simply deny that. Christianity doesn't assume that. So that part's easy to deal with. We just simply say, no, that's incorrect. But now we have to deal with the first part. How does God legislating morality not make it arbitrary? Well, here's the reason. You have to remember, the Euthyphro Dilemma was about the pantheistic gods. The pantheistic gods have a world of difference between them and Christianity. They are fallible. They often do really bad things. They make bad choices. I mean, they're just not good. And the difference is the creator of Christianity is infinitely perfect, infinitely wise, infinitely good. He is essentially infallible. He's the perfect God. And so the perfect God can legislate morals according to his perfect character, and they are moral by virtue of his character, essentially. Because the pagan gods disagree, but the one true God doesn't. Now, let's break this down a little more. Another way to talk about the dilemma is something loved by all the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved by all the gods? Okay? The problem is, morality, because God commands, leads to this arbitrariness, like I was saying. God commands because it's moral, leads to morality having an independent existence. We talked about that. And we have essentially no problem with that because our God is perfect. So that issue doesn't, the Euthyphro Dilemma doesn't work. So I would argue for a form of divine command theory. Now, what is divine command theory? God commands us to perform an action, and he makes it the case that we have a moral obligation to do that action. And again, this is based on his own nature and character. It's based on his holiness or set-apartness. Premise 1, God's command to us to perform an action makes it obligatory for us to perform the action. Very good. Premise 2, it's possible that God could command us to torture children for fun. Conclusion, it's possible that child torture for fun could become morally obligatory. That's the argument against divine command theory. Here's the problem. They're in that definition of God, they're not using the Christian definition of God. They're using a definition of God that is not infallible, perfect, and morally upright. Torturing children, they're essentially saying, what if he ordered you to torture children? Well, here's the problem. He never would and he can't. And you might say, oh, what about Isaac? We can handle that, and we will. That's a very specific and unique situation. Okay? That was not a command to torture all children everywhere. That wasn't even really a command to torture children. It was a demand to sacrifice a child, which is different. Still very intense, but it is a different thing. So this idea, though, like, oh, God commands the Holocaust. Well, no. Oh, but no, he did back in the day when he told them to kill people. Okay, again, there's two different things here. There's a morality. Okay, and morality is true for all people at all times. And there are specific acts of God where he commands either a person or a nation to do something for a specific reason. And you cannot take that act outside of that context and that reason and simply say it's right or wrong. You have to look at the act in the context in order to do that. So that's why those situations, those were never commands to everyone. We can look at commands to everyone for all time. Those are the ones we've got to take a look at, and none of them fall into this category. So again, this fails, that argument fails because the Christian God is all good. And again, divine command theory works because of who he is, his nature and character. And so, the Euthyphro Dilemma poses an insurmountable difficulty for morally deficient deities, but not for the God of classical theism. And then I love this because Baggett brings up the best C.S. Lewis book ever, and at least his fiction books. I would argue Weight of Glory is probably one of his and The Poison of Subjectivism are two of his best non-fiction works. But Till We Have Faces is absolutely hands down his best fiction work. And it's so funny because anybody who's read a lot of C.S. Lewis or has taken C.S. Lewis courses, pretty much all of them argue that Till We Have Faces is C.S. Lewis's best book. And it's his moral apologetics book. So he often wrote, for example, a fiction and a non-fiction on a given topic. And so you have Mere Christianity, and I would argue that Till We Have Faces is essentially the fictional parallel to Mere Christianity in terms of the morality issues. And so this is what we have. We have this issue Until We Have Faces where there's two sisters, and one of the sisters experiences only the dread or fear of God. The other experiences the dread or fear and the love and joy of God. And the issue is that when it comes down to it, and I could do a whole lesson on this book, it's tons of fun. But essentially what it comes down to is when the older sister, the one who only has dread or fear, comes face to face and actually sort of sees what the other sister sees for a moment, she realizes she's in no position to judge God. We're simply not God, and in an hour of reckoning, it's for us, not him. And this is very important because a lot of people get hubris when they start to look and try and analyze God's actions throughout Scripture. And one, they just don't know what they're talking about half the time. They're ignoring things, they're putting their own framework on it, and their arguments are actually worthless. But there's another piece of it, though, where we have two instances, both in Job and in Paul, where people question God's character, his nature and character, his goodness or his justice. And God simply says, were you here when God made the universe? And that's Job. And then Paul, you're the pot. You're the clay that God made it into the pot. Is the pot able to question the potter? No, he made you for a reason. And so there's an aspect of this that, really is just, this is God, and we are not to question him on these things. We can ask, we can inquire, but we're not to judge him, not to sit in judgment over him. Finally, morality provides a credible reason to affirm the existence of God who is good, who is also the most dreadful and most beautiful. And this is the thing. In other words, justice is real, and so is mercy and love. And that's where we sort of get with the moral argument. And so, we've been going for about a half an hour. I don't see any comments or questions, so we'll probably end there. I don't see anything like that. So thank you guys so much for joining us here for the first chapter. I'm looking forward to the next section on stubborn moral facts. We're going to get into that. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach. Have a wonderful day.